Hi everyone, my name is Thomas and I want to show you some of the capture workflows that I have set up in Obsidian. This is my view in Obsidian. I'll make it a little bit simpler, hide some of these side panes. I usually keep the mind map around because I find it very helpful to navigate. I'll put this to the side so you can see the presentation on the one hand and some of the examples on the other hand. This is my first presentation on Obsidian. It's also my first presentation in Obsidian because there's a feature in Obsidian where you can do a basic presentation using Markdown for the slides. That's what I'm using on the right-hand side of the screen. So let's dive into it. First example is web clipping. It's the easiest workflow you can set up. It's only one step. Typically, you would use an extension like Mark Download when you're on a web page. Click on the extension, and you get the Markdown syntax ready to copy and paste, or even save directly into a file so that it shows up into your vault. You could also use an Obsidian extension for one of the browsers directly, or a bookmarklet. Like I said, it's an easy workflow, just one step. But I don't use it often. I probably should use it more, but I tend to go through Instapaper because Instapaper acts as a filter for content that you want to consume, so that not everything ends up into your Obsidian vault. Just to show you a quick example, this is from one of the courses in Building a Second Brain. This is a transcript of a video. I just captured the whole transcript in here, and so now I could go highlight it and take notes on it if I wanted to. That's just web clipping. Now let's go to a more complicated example, Kindle highlights. Very useful. I had a lot of books read on my Kindle and highlights taken on them that I never really looked at. And I was very excited when all of these highlights were pulled into Obsidian through a sync. The best way to set it up is through Readwise. Readwise is an aggregator for notes and highlights from many different sources. It is more steps as a workflow, but it's all automated, so that's great. Um, the highlights even link back to the Kindle passage. If you're on mobile, I haven't made it work yet on desktop because I use Linux. I think if you use the Windows desktop app, it should be able to link to as well. Let me show you a quick example. This is a book that I'm currently reading called Cast. So it will pull the front cover, some metadata, and then the highlights that I've made in the book so far. The mind map can be interesting there. It's a little hard to read right now, but it's able to also capture structural data like headers and chapter information. It's a little um, it's a little weird right now because the plugin keeps syncing, and as I'm reading the book, some of the nodes are for the date that it captured the highlights, but I can go in and start removing those and make sure that it completely matches the structure of the book in terms of chapters. So that's pretty useful as well to have sort of a map of the book in terms of the chapters. So that's how you set up Kindle highlights. There are in fact 3 plugins, but Readwise recently made their own official plugin, and so that's now a good default to use. Let's add one more step into the mix. Instapaper is another workhorse in the typical workflows that you would use. So for web articles, what I do is you save the web article to Instapaper, and then from Instapaper, it goes to Readwise, all of the highlights that you make. And then again, Obsidian will sync it. And so it adds Instapaper as a step. Again, this helps act as a filter because you don't necessarily want to take all of the articles that you read into Obsidian. You probably only want to take those that are useful enough to highlight and take notes on. I also use this workflow for blog reading, for example, starting with Feedly as an RSS aggregator, or even with news articles from the New York Times that I think I want to take some time to read. The note again links back to the article, so that's nice. Here is an example of what that looks like. So this is an article on how Basecamp blew up, where I took a few highlights, some interesting points that I felt were worth saving for later. And that's how I save web articles. Let's go to the next step. Tweets is something that people often want to capture. And really, you have many options. So tweets are just web pages. You can use the same flow that you use for web pages. You can also just put your tweets through Instapaper, the way we did before, but you could also do a standard web clip, or you could actually directly add Readwise in your tweet, and Readwise will collect the tweet for you. And so I want to show you a quick example of a tweet that I captured a while ago. It gives you some metadata, and then these are all the tweets. This is a long tweet session that I then started highlighting and used as an exercise in progressive summarization as part of the course, which resulted in this particular note based on that original content, where I summarize it to a takeaway. And so that's an example of how you capture tweet and how you can then further process those notes as part of your workflows. Let's move on to the next one, emails. Emails is an interesting one. I'm sure you can write your plugin to essentially export Markdown from any of the email clients, but I find it easier to just forward the email to Instapaper. And then again, you have an article in Instapaper that you can highlight, and then Readwise will pull it into Obsidian for you. Here's an example. This is my 2018 tax return where I took a note. I can even tag it and as part of Instapaper so I can get back to it through browsing for tags as well. Now let's go for a slightly more complicated workflow. This is one for PDF highlights. And the easiest one that I found, and I wouldn't necessarily call it easy, it takes a bit of setting up, is through a bibliography reference program called Zotero, where you can import PDFs, you can scan them, and then you can extract the highlights. One of the cool things is that the highlight in Obsidian actually links back to the highlight in the original PDF. So we recently bought an e-bike for the family, a cargo bike, and this is an example of the extracted notes that I have, which I was highlighting to make sure that I know how to maintain the bike properly. So for example, I should be able to click on this note, and then Zotero will automatically redirect me to the PDF to the actual highlight that I made. So that's pretty cool. Again, it takes a little bit of time to set up, but once it's set up, it works really well. It is a little bit more manual because you have to go through the steps in Zotero. I actually ended up making sort of a more detailed workflow diagram because I really needed to understand how it worked. And so uh, maybe what I'll do is I'll expand here so you can see that mind map a little bit better. So you have to store the PDF. You have to do something to the file, obviously read it, highlight, annotate it, extract, convert to a note, and then file the note. But this was really useful for me to sort of really map out the workflow that is involved in doing something as complex as capturing from PDF. So let's go back, go to the next example. This is an interesting one, podcast highlights. Still pretty new in general, podcast apps that allow you to bookmark. I used to use Podcast Addict, and it does have a feature, but it doesn't integrate as nicely with Pixel Buds or other earbuds. And so recently, Momento came out, which works for Android, and it's very similar to Air, which is a podcast app for the Apple environment. And the nice thing is, again, you can use Readwise and get it into Obsidian. And then there's a few cool things you can do. So this is what it actually looks like. Here's a highlight that I captured. I did that by just double tapping on my Pixel Bud, which made a bookmark in the podcast. And then I can get this again out of here. And then one of the nice things that it lets you do is it lets you actually embed the exact snippet of where you took the quote right into your Obsidian. You can play back from here. So that's pretty cool as well. So that's for podcast highlights. One more example I want to give. I bought a Remarkable. It's essentially an ebook pad, a little bit like the Kindle in terms of screen display, but you can write on it, and it's kind of the closest that you can get to the feel of paper. And what I use it a lot for is actually to capture 10 IDs every day. And then what I do is I write it on the Remarkable, I OCR and email it from the Remarkable to myself, and I copy and paste it into Obsidian. It's all a little bit clunky. It's harder to automate. I have to do this manual copy and paste. I'm sure because it's a Linux-based system that it would be possible to create tools to do this a little bit faster. But this is what I have for now, and it works for me. This is what I use it for. Let me show you one list that I've captured that way. Let's see. These were some ideas I had around capture when I took the 12 cohorts of building a second brain. And then lastly, obviously, you can also just use Obsidian to directly capture your thoughts. That's really the easiest way to use Obsidian to do any kind of capture. One of the things that I do is do a daily log that gives me some prompts to fill in for the day. And so here's an example, planning my day, what do I want to do, some personal notes, some reflections at the end of the day, what do you want to do tomorrow, what did I achieve today? And so that's pretty straightforward as well. It's just Markdown. You already know how to do this. So that kind of concludes a quick tour through some of my capture workflows. There are many more workflows that you could set up. One thing that I'm looking at right now is something that allows you to essentially grab a part of your screen, convert it to OCR, and have it as Markdown directly into your Obsidian. If you have any cool workflows that you have that I should know about, please feel free to share. Hope this was entertaining or informative, and until next time.